So, Dia Charja, agus Vorgate Falcha and so Inov. Good evening, you're all very welcome here this evening to our public lecture as part of the 7th International Conference of the International Network for the Study of Spirituality, with the theme of spirituality, critical reflection and professional practice in an uncertain world. I'm Dr. Seamus Dillon and I'm the head of department here in the School of Humanities, and on behalf of our school and the wider SETU community, I'd like to thank Dr. Michael O'Sullivan and his team for organising such a great conference. And not only have Michael and his team excelled in the logistical organisation of the conference, but I think that the invited speakers are also excellent and looking forward to tonight's speaker in particular. This evening, we're delighted to have Professor Jonathan Wooding talking to us about the appeal of Celtic spirituality. Celtic spirituality of the 4th and 5th centuries and its integration, I suppose, with the emerging Christian church in Ireland is an interesting topic. Indeed, Celtic spirituality itself is the fascinating topic, with the pre-Christian Celts placing so much importance on the intersection of mind, body, spirit, and indeed their living environment, the environment all around them. And perhaps the Celtic gods today were responsible for the sunshine that we have, that we had. So, with the arrival of Christianity to Ireland, there was a marriage of sorts of Celtic spirituality and Christian spirituality, but all the time spirituality itself remained and remains intrinsic to the Celtic peoples. Professor Jonathan Wooding is an Australian-born church historian. He was director of the programmes in Celtic Christianity at the University of Wales, Lampeter, Trinity, St David from 1998 to 2013. He held the Sir Warwick Fairfax Chair of Celtic Studies at the University of Sydney from 2013 to 2021, and he has written or edited 16 books and has written over 60 articles or chapters in books concerning topics in church history, monasticism and the cult of saints in the Celtic world, including several studies of the cult of St. Brendan, and I'm sure he'll tell you in a second the importance of today's date in relation to St. Brendan. But please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Wooding.
Well, it's a great pleasure to accept the invitation to talk to this very friendly conference, I have to say. I've had a most marvellous day today, and also to come to Ireland to talk about this topic is always a pleasure. I spent some years in Ireland as a student, and always I feel like I come home when I land on these shores. This is, in a way, Ireland's intrinsic to much of what I do in my life, as indeed the other Celtic nations as well. And Celtic spirituality, I suppose I've never thought of spirituality as my central interest, but Christian spirituality probably more specifically. But in many ways, one of the things about taking on a topic which is set for you in a way is you start to think in ways that test your mind a bit, that make you actually respond to the challenge to explain. And actually, Celtic spirituality in some ways strikes me as really a better label for what we're going to talk about. So always good to turn up and think differently. 2023, I beg your pardon, not a good start, is an apposite date on which a year in which to review the concept of Celtic spirituality. Because in many ways the modern interest in the topic burgeoned with the publication of Ian Bradley's short book, The Celtic Way, in 1993. And that sort of changed my life, as well, as I'll explain in a moment. In 1993, I'd never even heard of Celtic spirituality. I sort of did it. I was a student who had been trained in medieval and Celtic studies, and as part of a group of younger scholars, I was younger in 1993 than I am now, naturally enough, and we were, in a way, responding to what was a somewhat conservative trend in Celtic studies to study early Irish texts, for example, mainly in terms either of philology, so very much language-centred studies, or also what was often called a sort of political hermeneutic, that reading everything in terms of dynastic politics and the struggle for power in early Ireland, which always seemed a bit counterintuitive to me, seeing as most of these works are written in monasteries and contained overtly religious motifs. Now, in those days, to be interested in this would have been extremely niche. But you know that old adage, which the job you're going to do in the future hasn't been invented yet. In 1993, I was studying something that half a dozen people were interested in. By 1998, I'd been appointed to a lectureship for the main purpose of teaching Celtic Christianity, and found myself the head of a master's program at Lampeter University in Wales that had, I think, something like 60 students on it at the time. So there's a subject that came from nothing. Now, that experience for me was enormously formative. You know, in a way, I was feeling my way into being a person who used mainly theological hermeneutics. But in the next few years, I met so many people working in so many areas of study of religion, theology and spirituality, that in a way it transformed my entire career. And what I'm going to talk about tonight in many ways is the lived experience of that. Having spoken to hundreds of people, students, scholars, practitioners, people in religious life, all about what the Celtic tradition meant to them. So that's why I'm here, and explains a bit about where I'm coming from. There's also some nice pictures, because when you study this topic, you do get to see some pretty interesting places. So at least if you're feeling after the end of a long day, you know, you sort of want to relax a bit, let the verbiage flow over you and just look at the pics, you know. Okay. Now, on this journey with us, however, I should say we're going to bring a friend, one of my favourite saints, St. Brendan, and in many ways probably the person who I've spoken most about in my career of all the saints that I'm interested in. And he is, of course, the most famous pilgrim monk, or peregrinus. I'll tell you a bit more about a peregrinus and peregrinatio in a moment. He was a native of the kingdom of Altriga, which is roughly centred on modern Tralee in County Kerry, where he was born around 500 AD. You can see I'm not so good at formatting PowerPoints. Something's gone astray there. I'm like those Irish scribes who sort of went round the corner and under another line. You know? I'm not joking. I was once asked to... I used to work in a university which didn't teach Celtic studies or anything like it, but there was someone teaching typography, and they asked me to give a lecture on how manuscripts were written and how it affected the way that layout works. Sorts of things you can do with skills. He died at Clonfert in County Galway, where he is buried. We don't know quite on what spot. Some people think they do. And so he's a saint of, roughly 1,500 years ago, 1,400 and something. And he's still a saint who is enormously meaningful to people. First of all, he is the most famous voyaging saint within the Irish tradition, but also he is an internationally famous figure. His story was taken to, or possibly even written in Europe, in the so-called Voyage of St. Brendan, Navigatio Sancti Brendani Abbatis, the Voyage of St. Brendan the Abbot, written about 800 AD. That story was circulated so widely in medieval Europe, it has more manuscript copies than Marco Polo's travels. That sort of puts it into perspective. Absolute bestseller. Also, there are many fascinating vernacular versions in the continental countries. There are versions in Dutch, in Icelandic, in French. Each of them a literary masterpiece of its own. And the Voyage of St. Brendan is itself a literary masterpiece. So, you know, people like, you think about the heroes of the Irish past. I mean, Cuchulainn might be the name you'll hear about here, but over there it's Brendan. Okay, he is the international hero of medieval Ireland. You'll come with us on this journey, okay? No, you won't be always at the centre. More later on that. Now, a little bit of explanation is probably needed. Not everybody here comes from Ireland or even a Celtic country, or like me, a diaspora country full of Irish people. So Celtic. The Celtic peoples, just so you know, when I say just so you know, not everyone agrees. I just want to put that out. That's Celtic studies altogether. Are those whose nations either speak or historically have spoken Celtic languages. So if you're Irish, even if you don't speak Irish, your nation is Celtic by designation, by its language. I know a lot of Irish people don't have much time for being called Celts. Being Irish is quite good enough. People in other Celtic nations feel as well. It's a language family, but it also speaks to some historical unities. But the Celtic language speaking countries, past and present, that are in the medieval and later period: Brittany, part of France now today, Cornwall, county of England, Ireland, the Isle of Man, Scotland and Wales. So when I'm talking about Celtic spirituality, in this lecture I'm mainly talking about examples from those places. Though Ireland and Wales were the largest earlier literary record, probably mostly at the centre. Though this is a picture of Scotland, admittedly a monastery founded by an Irishman, but there you are. Okay. Sources of the Celtic element in Celtic spirituality are looked for by people, well, a number of places. I mean, Seamus has mentioned a couple of other ones that people look for in prehistory, pre-Christian culture. But Celtic spirituality, in the way that I've always encountered it, mainly people are looking back to the churches of the first millennium prior to the reforms of the 11th century. So before the modern iteration of a Rome-centred church, the early medieval church, recognising Rome as the seat of the principal apostolic bishop, but a much more regionalised church than that which comes later. Looking in Ireland at a church then that often has its own distinctive local culture, as most early medieval churches did, I should say. And the other place they look for Celtic spirituality particularly is in the traditional culture of remote areas of the modern Celtic nations, you know, where the folklorists and the anthropologists and others tended to go to look for the language and the authentic culture that comes with the language. That's a technical definition, but I asked someone recently, you know, what was Celtic spirituality? And they said, oh, it's like Be Thou My Vision, you know, which is an early famous hymn, of course, everywhere really, but particularly translated from an early Irish text. And then another one said, oh, it's Enya. Enya, if you don't know, comes from an Irish-speaking town in Donegal. So these are sort of the simpler ways of saying what I just said, okay? So there's different ways you can look at that. I'm not going to talk about either of those things further, or indeed about music at all, actually. So that's a spoiler alert. Okay. Now, going back to the modern movement, Ian Bradley, who I think in some ways is responsible for the great burgeoning in this topic in the early 90s, himself says he thinks that it really all began in the 70s, and particularly quotes the pastoral theologian John Macquarie in his book Paths in Spirituality, who said, although it belongs to a culture that has almost vanished, Celtic spirituality fulfills in many respects the conditions to which a contemporary spirituality would have to conform. At the very centre of this type of spirituality was an intense sense of presence. But this presence was always mediated through some finite this-world reality. Now, I suppose I feel that that's a statement, trying to decode that a bit, which is sort of about the idea that on the one hand, it's a type of spirituality that's of a place, that's perhaps people's search for something relatable, but also particularly in that second sentence, I think there's a sort of, I suppose, a response to the idea that this is not a theology or a spirituality that's essentially centred in idealism, that behind idealism there's also a materiality. In other words, that we're looking for something that is to be found not just in philosophy, but in a sort of rooted philosophy. So a little bit of a dig at modernism or postmodernism, I think, there in some ways. You can read any theological statement, particularly of this type, any way you really want. But that's, I suppose, how I would see it. Now, looking back after 30 years, I think of Ian Bradley's book as having something of the same quality as perhaps the famous work by Esther de Waal about the Benedictine tradition, the taking of a medieval spirituality, but one particularly centred in the monastic way of looking, and trying to mediate that for people in the secular world. That seems to be one of the really central features of the way that this type of movement was taking off in that period. I think Ian would forgive me if I said that his book in some ways was rather less accurate than Esther's account of the Benedictine period. If you go and read Ian's works, he keeps writing these successive books in which he sort of apologises for getting it wrong in the last one. There's a sort of permanent mea culpa going on. He wouldn't mind if I said that. I have to say that. He'd say it himself. But there's a moment in which that reflects something that I think very important, which is, without making special claims to my own subject area, There's a lot more written about Benedictine spirituality than there is about Celtic spirituality. To even get into the source material is a bit of a journey. Much of the best information about this topic was not even in translation or even in readable editions in the 1990s. You would need to go into a lot of material that is either in Latin untranslated or in Old Irish untranslated. And believe me, that second one is no joke as a subject. There's a lot of work there. One of the benefits of this popular interest has been to really push on the creation of much more accessible editions of materials of particular religious influence. And the work of people like John Carey in particular has highlighted perhaps the extent to which a lot of the vernacular material produced in this period it contains remarkable amounts of diversity and religious speculation, that we have a very rich tradition here. But when Ian was writing his book back in the 90s, and from the perspective of not being a person much rooted in the Celtic tradition, I think that it only really whetted people's appetite for more that needed to be discovered. It's had an enormous benefit to the whole subject, I think, looking back. Now, Ian himself said, looking back on the topic, that he's convinced of one thing, that pilgrimage is its single most important and distinctive theme. So there's something stuck up there for you to consider. Pilgrimage is a central theme. And I actually think he's completely right about this. I think there are other things as well. I think that the particular interest in monastic culture also reflects a broad trend in spirituality, perhaps what I remember Philip Sheldrake once calling the dissatisfaction with the technical language of theology, the need to find a way of understanding religion using hermeneutics that are more accessible. And that monasticism, I guess, this is me now talking, not him, always seems to me to have a particular appeal for the fact that it's about a theology you learn by doing it rather than philosophising about it. That in a way that people find something relatable in that. But pilgrimage, as Ian said, is the other central thing, and particularly, of course, something that is central to the whole idea of the early medieval Celtic cultures, and particularly, of course, central to the cult of St Brendan. And that's the concept of peregrinatio, okay? Peregrinatio, which gives us our modern word pilgrimage, via French. If you know any philology, you can work that one out. But it doesn't mean pilgrimage. I want to say that. I mean, when Ian's saying pilgrimage, he means peregrinatio. But to translate peregrinatio in reality, it's a Latin word meaning to become a stranger, or rather to make oneself a stranger, which is a very monastic idea if you think about it. Obviously, in a way, to be a Christian is to make yourself a stranger to your own family, but making yourself a stranger to society, to leave society in an overt way, that's a very monastic act. But also, when you're out here, in this part of the world, in the early Middle Ages, you're a long way from Rome, and you're a long way from that idea of the Roman household. Your idea of family might run to, 30, 40 people really constitute your family, not mum, dad and the 3 kids, living in a house in Via Appia or something. And the making oneself a stranger to one's own country is a central motif. And in the early period, we have trouble distinguishing between peregrinatio in that late Roman sense of really just being an exile or a stranger, and when it begins to carry its slightly more monastic sense of sort of going somewhere, but not necessarily in the way we go on a pilgrimage, but a monk going on a long journey to somewhere else sometimes, going indeed into a sort of mystical journey. St Patrick, writing in the 5th century, I don't know if you all know that St Patrick wrote, but he's one of the few people from that time we actually have in these islands who wrote his own account. And you can go online and read it. There's a good site put up by the Royal Irish Academy with the text. Everyone should read this text. It's a remarkable Christian classic. He actually talks about how he was taken as a child from his home in Britain, because he was a Romano-Briton, brought to this country and reflected then upon his state of being in this country. I'll come to that a bit more about that in a moment. But he knew that word in the late Roman sense of just being a stranger. St Augustine, writing in Rome, thought about being a Christian as being a peregrinus. But in these waters up here, in a way, it becomes this word for a journey over the sea, or at least over a border, to become someone who lives outside their own world. Going away, going to the edges. And in Celtic Christianity and the early medieval, Celtic spirituality in the early medieval period, going to the edges to look back upon the world you have left, going into remote places, going to thin places. That's a modern term invented by George MacLeod, the founder of the Iona community, but it could be an early medieval idea. Because in these stories of these saints, St Brendan goes out into the ocean to seek God. Sometimes the saints go to the edges, they go to the coast, they go on journeys into the wilderness, where sometimes in the vernacular tradition of that period, they end up talking to heroes from the past. St Patrick talks to Cuchulainn, Columba talks to Mongo and MacFeachna, and this is a vehicle for time travel almost, or conversations across time. Sort of Doctor Who of its time, I guess, you know. But the point is, it's about the fact that going into remoteness is a place where you can find the mystical. You don't find it just by an interior journey, you actually go somewhere, and that's something very particular about the Celtic tradition. That's a real thing, in a way, Quarry's words, you know, a genuine lived reality, if you like. Okay, now that's not the only things that people find important. Another thing that is very important in the modern iteration, but probably also in the early medieval one, is a sense of place. This picture always does it for me because, in a way, it's about people going into the Celtic lands to find a connection. There are many people who travel into the Celtic world today in the search of something relatable. People in Ireland may go to the places that are special places, remote places within their nation to find that thing. English people go to Wales searching for something they feel is older than the English church, which is a younger church than the church in Wales at the time. I don't mean the church in Wales, the Anglican church in Wales, I mean the Welsh church in the past. This is the visits by the representatives of the Eastern churches, 14th July 1925, when they went to St David's. Now, what were they doing in Britain in 1925? Well, it was the centenary of the Council of Nicaea, obviously, and it was an ecumenical moment. But also there was a special resonance to them going down into Wales. The Welsh church had just become separated from the rest of the Anglican church, had become the church in Wales rather than just the Church of England in Wales. It was disestablished. There was a sort of context in which people were thinking about their Celtic past, and that was this reach into something older, something deeper than the here and now, and crossing that boundary into the earlier period to try to get a sense of something different, something which they could, in a way, compare or to find diversity in. Okay, and this is pretty diverse when you think about it. But in a way, you know, it represents what people are looking for. Many people today in Britain who are Orthodox go on pilgrimages during the summer to the Celtic nations because in a way they feel it takes them to a time when everything was further back, you know, when it was before all the divisions. And so this search for something relatable in the distant past is a very real part also of people's interest in Celtic Christianity. I will say that English people often go to Wales to feel connected to a sort of shared Britishness. You wouldn't be surprised to find that, you know, the Welsh don't always see the same way, but you know, but that's living in the Celtic world. You know, mutatis, that would work for Ireland, I'm sure, as well. Okay, so I suppose in a vague sense, I'm trying to say that this is about travelling one way or the other. We may go on pilgrimages to other places to find something relatable. We may be following the teachings of people in the distant past who travelled to find something themselves, and in travelling to find that thing, gained an authority as people coming out of the wilderness. They emulated the desert fathers going into the desert. They emulated the early prophets going into the desert. They emulated Jesus retreating into the wilderness, which, by the way, in the medieval Bible is just all desertum anyway. They weren't translating directly from the Hebrew. So, often these things are just about going from here to there to gain perspective, or maybe to seek to come closer to God by going out there, or, if we want to look at a broader sense of spirituality, seeking for something older, different and more diverse. The Irish indeed constructed in their literature often a sort of equivalence in the depth of antiquity in Ireland to the depth of antiquity in Scripture. You know, they saw their heroes of the past as being part of a sort of world leading to Christianity, on its way to Christianity. They were trying to accommodate that different past of these islands into the same space as the inherited past of their Christianity, which of course was over there, you know, in a different part of the world. So it's all about movement and a search in space. Okay. Now, sometimes when you go in search of something, you find what you're searching for, and sometimes it isn't necessarily entirely authentic. I asked a group of pilgrims coming from North America, led by someone, a former student of mine, what they thought was the most Celtic place they'd been to in Wales. And they said, a place called Pisteth, which is a little church on the coast up in Gwynedd in North Wales. And if you look at this photo on the floor, the locals have actually tried to make this church as medieval as they possibly could. They've kept it very bare, and there's actually even straw on the floor, like it's like a medieval building. In fact, it's only, you know, a fairly late medieval building. And in a sense, it's not the antiquity of the building beyond a certain point, because it's a post-Norman church in Wales, if you like, it's a post-Reformed church. But it's what they find in it is something they see as Celtic. It's on the coast, it's small. To quote John Kinross talking about small churches, it's the small musty ones that seem to speak more of God. They may be difficult to find. The path may lead across a boggy field. The door sometimes needs a rugby footballer's heave to open it. But there is peace, wonder, quiet, all the elements sadly missing in our world today. If you know the history of many small communities in the Celtic world, they're not quiet and peaceful really because anyone wants them to be that way. They're mostly quiet and peaceful because they've been depopulated. And the reason their churches are small is because they missed out on growing at the end of the medieval period. And so no one rebuilt the church. So they're often circumstantially, they seem like sort of hermit cells, but they're really just parish churches. But still, that doesn't necessarily matter. A symbol evokes a narrative, and the narrative of the small church, which is very common in our part of the world, the narrative of the small church takes us to something important. Because behind the symbol, there's actually a reality. And one of the really annoying things about working in Celtic studies is it's full of people who always like to sort of dismiss stuff. Oh, no, they've got that wrong, you know. It's not really right. I can take you through the history of this place. It was never like that. But it is different. All of the settlements where we have Celtic speaking seem to evince some difference of ecclesiology. In Cornwall, you can see it's very interesting because Cornwall and Devon, two adjacent counties, as Oliver Pardell in a recent study has pointed out, in Cornwall you have 196 parishes and 142 different dedicatory saints, 103 of which have indigenous names, so names in Cornish, which is close to Welsh, it's a, in Celtic language. In Devon, a slightly more English county, 450 parishes but only 60 dedicatory saints, 43 of which are universal, they're not local saints. So there's something very different going on there. And if we think that's just unique to Cornwall, no, it's a pattern we find in lots of places. In fact, you also, as Oliver points out in his study, there's also lots of very small ecclesiastical sites, lots of holy wells, standing crosses. These are people whose, pattern of worship is not confined to large central churches necessarily. And there's a very great emphasis upon cults of local saints. If you look at Tomasa Carragorn's magnificent study of Irish churches in the early Middle Ages, it isn't quite the same as this, but it's got the same basic pattern of lots and lots of little churches. There's something very distinctive about where the early medieval Celtic world carried out its ecclesiology. Okay, if you want everything to be unique, I've got some bad news for you. Everywhere in early medieval Europe was different. Okay, the idea that the Celtic churches were some special breakaway that sort of missed out on everything else, that they weren't really aligned with Rome, they weren't really Catholic, all that stuff. They're just different, and different everywhere is a bit different, It's not uniquely different, but it's uniquely different in as much as it's different, and it's different in its own way. And when you get out here, there is one other thing that probably does make a general difference to other parts of Europe, and that is we're a long way away from the centre. If Christianity centred on the Mediterranean, it is different out here, and it's different for one other really obvious reason. Ireland was not part of the Roman Empire. Wales, Cornwall, Scotland were all a little bit on the edge of the Roman Empire. It's possible that when Roman Christianity got here, it was still Roman Christianity. The churches here, still acknowledged their affiliation back to that larger church, but it just never fell on the ground in quite the same way because these were not so Romanised societies. And so the pattern comes up differently. There's something different going on here. The danger is, of course, we're always inclined to overstate these sorts of things in terms of what we want from our modern desires. Though, as I say, you can treat your modern desire as something related to the past. We're not here, perhaps, always to tell everyone there's, everything is a myth, because myths are enabling as well. But it doesn't hurt to get things right. Now, one thing particularly that seems to me to speak right through the history of Celtic spirituality is what I would call liminality, okay? And if you don't like, buzzwords, being on the boundary will do nicely. That we're dealing with churches where people, for one reason or another, ended up in a world in which there was perception that these churches were at the edge of something. St Columbanus, an Irishman who went to live in Gaul in about 590, writing to Pope Boniface in 607, said, "For all we Irish, inhabitants of the world's edge, are disciples of St Peter and Paul and of all the disciples who wrote the sacred canon by the Holy Ghost, and we accept nothing outside the evangelical and apostolic teaching." So he's keen to point out, he acknowledges the fact that the Bishop of Rome is the apostolic leader of the Western Church, but we the Irish live on the world's edge. Now, in Cheryl Hunt's presentation earlier, I remember we were talking about worldview. This is how they saw the world. The way a world was drawn in the early Middle Ages was what's called a wheel map. The Earth's land masses were a disc, and Jerusalem was at the centre. I've borrowed these pictures, rather badly copied, from my friend Thomas O'Loughlin, who's one of the people who's really looked at this question. His book, Celtic Theology, by the way, should be standard reading for everybody. It's a terrific study. But here we see the world defined as concentric circles, and the islands of Britain and Ireland are in the sort of margin on the edge. What lay beyond? Well, when you go out there, I don't know what direction I'm pointing in here, but west, okay? Once you go out beyond West Kerry, you're sort of near the edge of the world. Now, that's not just a mystical idea that is floated around in medieval Irish texts. It is how they saw their world, and it's how everybody else saw their world in the Western Church. So the Irish had a natural authority here from coming from the edge of the world. Okay, so the Peregrini, people like Columbanus going to the continent, were preaching something, a message formed by contemplation on the edge. That's not literary reality, that's the world as they perceived it. St Patrick, writing in the 5th century, speaks of his own journey coming from Britain to Ireland to live, bringing the gospel to Ireland, and seeing that symbolic of the march of Christianity through the world to the edges of the world. And he quotes Matthew 24:14, "And the gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. In this way I can imitate somewhat those whom the Lord foretold would announce his gospel in witness to all nations before the end of the world. This is what has been fulfilled. Look at us, we are witnesses that the gospel has been preached right out to where there is nobody else there." Great Blasket Island, that really is the furthest west bit. So. Okay, but the world hadn't ended, which meant possibly there was something more they hadn't quite reached. This is a bit like reflective practice, isn't it, really? I'm getting warmed up to this now. He's looking at where he is in his personal narrative, how he's placing himself in the world. I'm sure it's another abuse of that term, but anyway, a bit of entertainment at this time of night. But he's seeing the march of the gospel to the ends of the earth. And so when they're exploring beyond there, and they were, Irish monks were going right out in the ocean. Some Brendan story is, literature, but there's a truth in there. That may be what they saw happening. They were seeing themselves in a sort of apocalyptic space. And maybe they felt there'd come an island and they'd land on that island and then, They didn't necessarily think the world was going to last that long. That was also part of their worldview. Nobody in the first millennium really thought we were going to be waiting until 2023, So try and see it from their point of view. In the Voyage of St Brendan, we hear that monks who live on an island called Delightful Island, perhaps Rathlin O'Byrne, I've always wondered, but an island just off Slieve League in Donegal, you are undoubtedly living at the gate of paradise, because near here is an island which is called the Promised Land of the Saints, where the night does not fall nor day end. And this is supposed to be just near Slieve League. Mons lapidum, it is in the Latin. Now, I have a disclaimer to make here. My family come from Ardara, so obviously I think the Promised Land is in Donegal, so just saying, But this, in a way, is talking about things they were concerned about, because we know that around that time, Irish monks were going right up into the north. A man called de Quille, who was a monk who lived, he was a sort of casualty of the Viking Age. He was driven out of Iona and ended up working in Aachen at the court of the Carolingian emperor. He said it is now 30 years since clerics, who had lived on the island of Thule. It's clear he means Iceland. I can't go into whole detail here, but he means Iceland. The 1st of February, the 1st of August, told me that not only at the summer solstice, but in the days round about it, the sun setting in the evening hides itself as though behind a small hill. No, is there day and is there night, or is there no day and no night? Is it like the New Jerusalem? They're interested in these problems. They're interested in other problems as well, like how do you keep the night office when there's no night? These are important questions, in terms of monastic practice. But they're also interested in that bigger question. Out there in the ocean, things are different. Why are they different? What does that tell us theologically? What does that tell us in terms of our understanding of the grand narratives? Right? So, interesting stuff. Okay. What I do on my holidays, I'm actually involved in a project in Iceland where we're looking for traces of Irish monks. We know they were there. And there are these hand-dug caves in the south of Iceland, and these are ones we're working at. We're cataloguing all these crosses and other objects that seem to converge with the types of ones we have in the Hebrides. So I've planned a few of them up here for you. If you see on the top of that picture, these are some ones we've drawn. We're trying to work out how much we can converge these diagrammatic crosses with actual art styles that are found in the Western Hebrides. We think these are monks coming out of Iona, possibly settling here. So, there's a practical reality, again, I'm trying to say here. This is, again, coming back to that thing as a lived experience, something rooted in the real world, from which some of these more diverse and colourful iterations of spirituality come. And we have a sort of narrative theme here that within Celtic spirituality, that sense of place, that sense of presence, and that sense of the going to so as to see the thing. Going out, do we find when we go out the encounter with the mystical, but also do we gain perspective on where we are when we return? When I was a child, I was greatly excited. I think I was 7 years old when Apollo 8 went around the moon, and when they were coming back, they took that picture of the Earth. You look back upon where you have come from the edge of the known world, really, or the known the bit of the solar system you live in. Well, the bit of the solar system they lived in, Iceland, was sort of like where the moon is for us. They were a bit quicker to get to. But still, there's something important about that. And you could look at this and say, this is Irish people going and living on islands, but it meant something more than that. We need to think about it in those terms. And what did Celtic spirituality in this period really give you. And it was a sense of there and here and of going to and coming back. And these people, their presence in the ocean gave them a moral authority. It gave them a way of reflecting back to people ideas about how to live that had come from the edge. Some practical examples in a minute. Now, one concept that is also clearly seen closer to home in that period, and is one that is very appealing in our modern search for rootedness, for a sense of place, is the concept of a thin place. And Iona is where this idea was coined by George MacLeod, the founder of the Iona community. But it comes out of an early medieval idea. Adam Norn of Iona, who would have stood and looked at this hill just as I did when I took this photo, just as George MacLeod did, talks about this hill, the Hill of the Angels, where the citizens of the heavenly country were occasionally seen to descend at the bidding of the blessed man. A modern theologian living on this island has a sense of connectedness, of the thinness between himself and the heavens, in the same way as that early medieval saint did 1,000 or more years before. On this island in North Wales, Bardsey Island, we find a similar sentiment in the Life of St Elgar of Bardsey, when Elgar, the hermit, says to Caradog, another hermit, "Holy spirits taking upon themselves by the will of God the form of corporeal beings, constantly day and night, succoured me as if I were destitute and enfeebled. They report to me the present life is like the flower of the field, the future like an odour of balsam, comforting me lest I fall in the path, so that once the enemy is defeated, I should receive the crown and rewards." In this beautiful little life, another thing that is mentioned particularly is Elgar found, as other people have found on Bardsey, the fact that you could live behind the shadow of this mountain that lies on the near side, close to the land. You could live your life looking only upon the sea and never looking at the land you had left behind. And in this way, a sense of place and a sense of presence shapes the entire theology of the man who lives there, the entire worldview. So in a sense, that feeling of being able to find isolation is a gift of the landscape, and it's one that is very meaningful in making a holy place. There have been hermits living on Bardsey right into modern times. Up until the 1990s, there was an Anglican hermit who lived out there. And it's always been a special place of pilgrimage to people in Britain. Now, I want to bring this together by saying that, in a way, the message that was created in the early medieval Celtic Christianity, if you like, the one that was taken from the edges to the centre, was a way of trying to present a way of living in the monastic tradition of churches that had a very strong regard for monastic life, take that and present it as a program for the ordinary people to follow. When St Brendan comes back from the promised land of the saints, he describes it as a place that is divided by a river. And on one side of the river, the side we are on, we can glimpse the promised land, but it's only on the other side that the land awaits, where Christ will live with the chosen for 1,000 years in the last days, as in Revelation. That is a metaphor in some ways for the inner and outer enclosure of the monastery, the place where the secular folk can visit, but the inner enclosure where you will have your rest untramped by the feet of secular people, and the place which is the inner sanctum of the community, the place that is special to their retreat. I've always been struck by the fact that some early sites, like this one at Reesk in the Dingle Peninsula, actually has a wavy line down the middle to mark that boundary. And I've often wondered whether that is a symbol of a river in quite that way. In other words, the promised land in which Christ will reign with the chosen is actually the Irish monastery. The Irish monastery is a little snapshot of the promised land. When the monk St Fursey of Peyron, another Irish exile, was carried up into the heavens on the wings of angels, he was shown how the sinners who were gathered in a place at the mouth of heaven were burnt in proportion to their sins by cleansing fires. In other words, he was talking about purgatory, which seems to have been in its sort of basic medieval iteration an Irish idea. Now, before you think purgatory, yeah, what a horrible idea that is. Imagine you lived in a world where you thought that unless you died in a state of grace, you were going straight to hell. So the idea, sort of somewhere along the way, you could get off the train and make things better. Even if it meant a bit of pain, but also a bit of pain that was proportionate to what you did. Not just fires that burnt eternally, but in proportion to your own contribution. It's a very enabling idea, in a sort of way, better than the alternative. But the important thing is that this is also a metaphor for monastic penitential, for what goes on in the chapter of faults and is in the penitential documents. In other words, what the monks do to atone for their own sins is your program for what's going to happen to you later. So the monastery, again, is a snapshot of the heavens, a snapshot of what comes next. And what you're dealing with is a very clever sort of preaching. They're saying, this is how we live. Good way to live. This is what we've brought to you from the edges, what we have learnt. And our life is a metaphor for your life. And our program, I'm going to explain to you, is a lived reality, not only in our world, but even extending up into another world. So all the time it's about these boundaries. When you cross that boundary, it's not that there's nothing on the other side. There's a conversation with an ancient hero to give you a prophecy. There's a conversation with an angel or some other prophetic figure. There's an initiation into a diversity of experiences. But they're going somewhere. They're going something in an interesting and diverse way. Now, none of this is exactly unique all of the time. Okay, if you want everything to be unique, you're missing the point, because it's a whole connected up world. St. Patrick in his Confessio gives us one of the very few accounts of an early monk of having a mystical experience. How he, as Peter Brown put it in his account of this, the most prominent late antique historian, he said, it's when I went to St. Patrick, I suddenly began to see what it was like from the inside of being a holy man. This is how Simeon Stylites could have described to me what is being Simeon Stylites rather than everybody else doing it, by extension. Patrick, he said, talks about being on the mountain, tending the sheep. Faith grows with him when he's in a remote place. That's in some ways the quintessential experience of the Celtic holy man. But the same passage almost exactly you can find in the Life of Malchus by Jerome. I'm not saying he knew this one. Rather, in a way, this is the same story. We went into the wilderness, we tended the sheep, we were alone, we prayed constantly. God came to us in the wilderness. Now, I'll put this in a way to make a point which I think is important. It's not really that the Celtic tradition offers us something entirely unique. It does. I mean, there are many things that are particular and dramatic to the place that we are in that you will not find in other parts of the church, whether they're better or worse. But also many people go to find these things because they're common enough, but they're where we find them. And so going into Celtic spirituality is another way of accessing things that are otherwise hidden. You can read an Eastern Father or you can read Patrick, but each one of you takes you into a place about contemplation, about interior spirituality, but also an interior spirituality that grows in the wilderness, but it's where you find it. And I'm reminded in this respect of T.S. Eliot in his Four Quartets, his poem about Little Gidding in this case. There are other places which are also at the world's end, some at the sea jaws, or over a dark lake, or in a desert or a city. But this is the nearest in place and time, here in England, he said. He's talking about Little Gidding, a small intentional community of the 17th century, which was near where he lived. But people go to different iterations of spirituality, particularly with a monastic flavour or a sense of place, where they find them. And they find in each one sometimes some of the same things, because they're searching for something deeper, something relatable, something that is not now, but then that inspires something in the now. But we find them where we find them. Coming to an end here. What they're also doing often is they're going back into the world of late antiquity. Alistair MacIntyre, in his book After Virtue, an attempt to create a new ethics for the modern world in 1983, talked about how we needed a new way of doing ethics. We needed to go back to a time at the end of empire when people looked to different sources of authority. I think he'd been reading Peter Brown's theory of the holy man. Secular history, theology and philosophy are often connected. But he said at the end of it, what we really need is a new St. Benedict. We need, in a way, to take from the monastic tradition a broader idea of ethics formed in community. And one of the great outtakes of Celtic spirituality in recent years has occurred within what's called the neo-monastic community, people who are interested in exploring monasticism in the everyday world. Some of these are particularly interested in St. Brendan. They see St. Brendan and his journey in a boat on the ocean, forming a community within that tiny space, sort of like a positive version of Alfred Hitchcock's one about the lifeboat, you know. Well, William Bligh turned to a good story, but the idea that you grow in strength as a community on the ocean. But it's interesting to contrast that with the fact that that's one type of new monasticism for whom St. Brendan is the icon. There are others following MacIntyre who followed his idea and made St. Benedict their icon. And interestingly, they have a different idea of space. Their plan is to go to the waste places of empire, as they say, and they've led to particularly the rise of a large number of urban missions. They find the relics of empire and the waste places of empire within the decaying urban community. But others look outward. They see in pilgrimage the idea of finding a new monasticism, an enlightenment through looking out rather than within. And so this is how, in a way, a saint from one tradition and a saint from another tradition can be used to inspire different spiritualities, even reaching back into that same late antique world. It's not all Celtic what is going on in searching for these ideas, but people look to the Celtic tradition for one iteration, but often an iteration of the same basic concept, but they bring from it particular things that are meaningful to them. And in a way, this type of new monasticism in a way fulfills Ian Bradley's dictum that it's really all about pilgrimage. But with a different reference point, you can come to something rather different. Okay, just to finish up, because I should come back to St. Brendan at the end, I mentioned where St. Brendan comes from, particularly the work Navigatio Sancti Brendani Abbatis, The Voyage of St. Brendan the Abbot. If you've never read it, read it. Brendan's often claimed as the first European explorer of North America. I don't think he was, though I think the Irish probably saw Greenland, which is North America, so there you go. And if you've read Tim Severin's book about it, which most people seem to have done, read The Voyage of St. Brendan, it isn't the same. Thomas Merton, who read Navigatio Sancti Brendani, said it was the perfect symbolic tract upon the monastic life. It's an allegory of how monasticism is a journey of initiation. It's very meaningful as a spiritual text. It was also a major influence on C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. I've often wondered, in fact, whether the idea that Lewis's Narnia, which is a slightly more perfect place, which is also a simulacrum of the real promised land, which they go to at the end, is in fact in some way modelled upon that dichotomy in The Voyage of St. Brendan. There's the antechamber we may enter and wait, and there's the one we cross over into the real place. And if you don't think he was influenced by this text, read The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, his children's novel in the Narnia series, which is modelled on the Navigatio from beginning to end, almost completely. So very influential. J.R.R. Tolkien, lots of stuff taken from J.R.R. Tolkien. Someone today was telling me about another thing. Very, very interesting chap. They really were interested in this text particularly. This, of course, where it all began, and indeed if you read The Voyage of St. Brendan, you can see the person who wrote this text knew West Kerry very well. He describes how Brendan went to the remote part of his native region where his parents were living, but he did not wish to see them. That's just kids, they never come to visit, do they? But actually, this is good monasticism. You know, you've left Egypt, you don't go back to captivity, you know, you've got to stay away from your family. And if you read the story, he climbs up Brandon Mountain. Brandon Mountain was not in Ultriga, it was in Corcaguina, it's the other side. This is a really tight geographical narrative about being on the edge, and then when he departs, he goes down the other side of the mountain, not to his home territory. and it describes it perfectly. He sets out into the ocean. So every step in this text is about going on a monastic journey. It's a spiritual classic, really worth reading. And also, if you know your Irish geography, it works well. When they get into the ocean, they go for 40 days, and they come to a little archipelago which has sheep on one island, birds on another island, and a great big fish in the middle. There's some little joke there somewhere about dietary practices, but I haven't got time to go into it. And then for 7 years after that, they go round and round in the ocean, always coming back to this same place. And each year, they celebrate the feasts of the Christian calendar on the same days, on the same places. So they're not going anywhere in a straight line. And this is a metaphor for the entire liturgical year. The day, you go through the offices in the day, but you go through the year both in prayer, but also in breaking the pattern at the feasts. It emphasises the symmetry of the liturgy, but also the incarnation in it of Jesus, the birth, death, resurrection of the main feasts. Then at the end of it all, they get in a boat and they go east, not west, which means that the Promised Land is just off Slieve League, as I said, was Donegal by extraction. It's a metaphor for life. It's a metaphor for growth within life. You don't grow by hurrying to the conclusion. You grow by balance, by stability, by the liturgy, by the performance of liturgy, by a regulated life. So it's monasticism as a way to live. And the best thing about this text is it's so well written you can really believe it's a voyage that way to the other side of the ocean, which is something of the genius of the whole exercise. But those sheep and birds are also real, because in the Faroe Islands, in the description by the early Irish geographer I mentioned, the islands are now deserted in his time because the Vikings have been there, except for an abundance of sheep and sea birds. So the story is even incorporating, St Brendan's story is incorporating voyages of real monks. Well, St Brendan is a real monk, but I think the voyage is a literary work. But they're putting the real bits in, almost like a film puts in a real car at the beginning to tell you what era it is or a real place, and then takes you off to an imaginary place, and referencing a symmetrical and a spiritual pattern with an anchoring in the real. In a way, that is the genius of much of this material, and the way it builds its whole picture of a spirituality, a way that monasticism gives you a message of how to live, the way that the location of where you live gives you insights, takes you into spaces of revelation. There's a lot to discover in it. I could tell you about music, I could tell you about art, all sorts of other things, but an hour is not sufficient. And if, frankly, a lot of that was a bit distracting, the pictures must have been good anyway. So thank you for your attention.
So thank you, Professor Wooding, for a fascinating talk. I think you mentioned that the Celts in the first millennium didn't think that we'd still be here in 2023, but I think that looking back from here back to that period, I think you have given us, you've breathed life into that period and to those people for us. So thank you for that. I also think that for all of us who are interested in Celtic spirituality, and I suppose looking for answers in Celtic spirituality, that the Celts themselves, where we find those answers, the Celts themselves actually had further questions. So perhaps the answer to our question is another question.
Isn't that just spirituality altogether?
Perhaps. But we have a few minutes, and I know in a couple of minutes Michael wants to talk about make some announcements regarding tomorrow, but we do have time for some questions. Yeah. So you might just introduce yourself before you ask the question, yeah?
G'day, I'm Simon from Australia. I just wondered, Ireland, which is on the edge of the world and sort of on the edge of the Roman Catholic Church. I was just wondering what the influence of the Protestant Reformation may have been on the church in Ireland.
Well, I mean, the Reformation is a long way after what we're talking about, but I mean, in Ireland, of course, the Catholic Church was suppressed, but still survived, you know, as through external influence. So it's not really my period, but Obviously, one of the outcomes of that, from the point of view of preserving our early records of Celtic spirituality, is a lot of material was taken offshore, and some of our best preserved accounts of the early Irish Church come from monastic communities in exile on the continent. So, I mean, the Reformation, had a totally disruptive effect upon the medieval church, but, the church carried on in exile. But I'm not a Reformationist. I can't really answer that question beyond that.
Wait for the microphone, yeah.
I apologise for not being able to answer that question.
Peter, UK. Thank you for that. There was something that interested me about what you were saying about the motivations of the Peregrinati, because last time I was sort of reading around this stuff, which was about a generation ago now, there was an idea out there that the Celtic Church was strongly influenced by the North African tradition, and that they were doing something similar to the Desert Fathers. But my understanding of the Desert Fathers is that they were going into the desert to fight with demons or to go into the abode of demons. And it sounds as though the Peregrinati are doing something quite different. Is that right?
No, not necessarily. I mean, first of all, the Desert Fathers were an enormously influential model upon them. They'd read the life of St Anthony and the life of St Paul of Thebes, and probably the sayings of the Desert Fathers. We can't nail that one down quite as easily, but and also the life of Martin of Tours, which was heavily influenced by that. And they saw themselves in a similar way geographically. I mean, if the outer edge was there as the edge of the world world at the same time believed the equator was impassable. So the Desert Fathers were living on the edge of the world in another way, and both of these were waste spaces. And yes, there are, moral and amoral, non-moral perils in the ocean. There are plenty of accounts of battling with temptations and demons and so on. So yes, it's a spiritual warfare. Indeed, right at the beginning of one of the first lines of the Navigatio is about how when Brendan was engaged in spiritual warfare. That's what monks do. They fight both the metaphorical and the literal demons in that space. And obviously there are weird and wonderful creatures in the Navigatio, like the giant fish, who is in the control of God, but is still a perilous object. So, and Leviathan fights, Behemoth and these things in the story, So there are things out there that are perilous, because that's what being in the desert is, yeah. But, they're not very different in some ways. What I suppose I really do think, and I've said this recently actually, is that we need to start remembering that to medieval Europeans, what the Irish was doing out there in the desert is just as interesting in some ways to them as what the Egyptian monks were doing in the desert down there. That these are ocean fathers as opposed to desert fathers, but in their own time, they're closer and in some ways, much more at hand. They're doing the same thing, So, they are in many ways the same thing, And I think we shouldn't forget that. Again, there's nothing new under the sun here. A lot of these motifs are the same ones, but obviously they're different in a different place in a subtle way, because it's a real spirituality. It's not John of the Cross, in the desert in his mind, This is a real desert. It's a big wet one rather than the big sandy one. But then that's what desert means, It just means an empty place,
Okay, so we have time maybe just two further quick questions before the bus goes to the promised land.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was fascinating to hear. Just wondering, because I had the opportunity to do the experience of Loch there once, and I do remember, you do the stations and all these exercises that are claimed to be immemorial, really, like they come back to these years, and it seems to me that there's a sense of not only pushing to the edge of the world, but also pushing to the edge of the limits of the body as well, because it really pushes you to the limit, and you get to this fascinating state of bordering the delusion, a delusional state as well as the hunger and everything else. But
hitting the wall, they call that in athletics.
Indeed. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that as well, because it seems like there's also a putting the body under extreme conditions as well, in order to, I don't know, open a door to something else.
That's an interesting point, because I mean, obviously, that's a pattern, as it's called. You know, it's like a circumlinear pilgrimage, but it's one in which, in that case, you're on your knees, aren't you, some of the time, and that sort of. I've never done the Loch Derg one, but you know, I know a bit by reputation. It's the same idea, because the first point about it is it's not in a straight line. The circumlinear quality, in fact, is a metaphor for life. Because life doesn't go in a straight line necessarily. You know, you don't know when it comes to an end. It just happens, if you see what I mean. You know, and so you live your life each year going forward, but only going forward by going round. And that's a very good image, both in the liturgy and, you know, in reality. But the Voyage of St Brendan is an interesting example, and it would be characteristic of quite a lot of monastic theology. There's a tension between the idea that you may gain virtue by exertion, as opposed to the idea you may gain virtue by steadiness, by not overexerting yourself. In other words, that if you say an office of 3 psalms, you don't say 4 psalms, because you've got to balance work and prayer. Both are important. In other words, there is one tradition that says a pilgrimage may be something that you grow by gentle progression rather than by punishing yourself. I think in the Voyage of St Brendan, they're in a period, the rise of some ascetic movements, the Caeli Dei are probably the most famous ones here, the clients of God, who are people who are saying you need to push the boundaries, you need to pray more, you need to be more devoted, have more exertion, and you should not feast at the feast, you should even fast at the feasts. And so it's possible the Voyage of St Brendan and some other works of the same type are written in a way to say that's not how you do it. You should be doing it, you know, progress gently, you know, don't progress, don't show off as well, you know. And so the whole point about the Voyage of St Brendan is it's a parable of initiation. The monks don't get taken straight to the promised land because we have to learn to be worthy of entering it. We need to be enlightened. And if you want to look at its wider resonances, St Brendan is the only one of the voyaging saints, and there's quite a few, who gets to take his crew with him. All the other ones are abbots. They're all saintly abbots. They're people who should be the chosen of God. But Brendan is, in a way, the perfect steward of the people. He can bring other people through a journey that gets them there, but they don't get there immediately. They grow. But they don't grow by overdoing it. They grow by keeping their heads. And often he counsels them not to be afraid, counsels them not to drink water to excess, you know, counsels them to sort of, you know, steady on, old boy, you know, keep it steady. So, yeah, those are two different things in a way, perhaps, you know, the one which is the sort of penitential pilgrimage and the one which is really the monastic life as a way to live. But, you know, I don't know much about modern penance and what it's meant to mean, so you might need a modern theologian for that one. But that's how I would read this text anyway. It's sort of not like that, but it's obviously the same basic idea. Yeah. Sorry.
Okay. So, and briefly, if you would.
Yeah, sorry, I'm answering too long here.
No, you're okay.
So just a quick question. I'm curious, I didn't hear anything about the place of women in Celtic spirituality, so I'm curious if you have any quick thoughts about that.
Well, there are a number of people who've written about the place of women in Celtic spirituality who I don't think are reading the same texts as me. They're there, and some of them are important. You know, St Ita, for example, is a counsellor to Brendan and provides him with insights. But often, you know, women play a secondary role in this tradition. And sometimes it's a struggle to find as much positive material as you might want to on the matter. But, you know, also it's not really my main area of expertise. But the sort of, some of the representations you'll find in popular spiritual works may be a bit optimistic. And there's a fair bit of outright sexism in some of the saints' lives. You know, but you know, it was a different era. You know, but, also, it's not my main expertise, I should say, as well. There are female saints, and some of them very important. And obviously, St Bridget can extend her protective power over her own territory to the boundaries of Kildare, just as the male saints do. So they have their power if they're significant enough saints. Yeah, you know. So, yeah, but they don't always get to be top billing in a lot of the stories. And sometimes when they do turn up, it isn't necessarily particularly flattering portrayal, but you know, different time.
Okay, so Professor Wooding, thank you very much. For a 60-minute talk, it flew. It was like 5 minutes, so thank you very much. And on behalf of Michael and the organising committee, a sincere thank you, and we hope you get to Donegal while you're here.
I will.
Very good. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
I just